there are wars between kings and countries, churches and states, heads and arts and souls. But all are the same. War is nothing but a desperation. A time when it suddenly becomes necessary, and maybe even right, to do something wrong. Sometimes it takes one wrong to make everything else right. Nemesis and the Swan by Lindsay Bandy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our, I forgot what the panel title is exactly, but it's the world building panel. I'm super prepared. Okay. But hello, I'm just gonna introduce us a little bit. Basically, if you're watching this and you would like to purchase signed books, don't forget that you can do so at this festival, and you can find out more information at YALLWrite with a W. Write, as in writing, .org/books. And I am Veronica Roth. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. And I'm just going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves, if you don't mind. Can we start with Jennifer?
Hi, I am Jennifer L. Armentrout. I am an author of several young adult and new adult books, ranging from contemporary to science fiction, paranormal, and fantasy. My most recent book is the third book in the Origin series that came out in October. I'm like, what month are we in? And it is The Brightest Night.
Great. Feel free to jump, or if it's easier for me to just call on people, I will, but I don't want to teacher you. Somaiya, yes, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Hi, my name is Somaiya Daud. I am the author of the Mirage duology. Mirage came out in 2018, and Court of Lions, the sequel, came out this past August, and it is about a young girl who lives on a colonized backwater moon who's kidnapped to the Imperial Palace because she looks like the Imperial Princess to be her body double, and then all sorts of political shenanigans and revolutions sort of ensue.
Great. Traci, you want to? Good.
Hi, I'm Traci Chee. I'm the author of the Reader trilogy, which wrapped up in 2018 with The Storyteller, and most recently, We Are Not Free, which is very unlike the Reader trilogy, which was fantasy, and this one is historical. It's about a group of Japanese American teenagers in World War II who are forcibly evicted from their homes and sent to incarceration camps. It's loosely inspired by some of my own family's experiences in those camps, and it's a finalist for the National Book Award. So there's that.
Great. Awesome. Thanks. Samantha, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Samantha Shannon, and I'm the author of the Bone Season series, which is a 7-book series, 3 of which are currently out, and the 4th one is out in January. It's called The Mask Falling. And I'm also the author of this massive book. I only have the French edition on me, The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is my first standalone book, which came out last year.
Awesome. Thanks. Jordan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jordan Ifueko. My debut YA fantasy novel, Raybearer, came out this year. Hit the New York Times bestseller list, and the sequel is coming up next year. So please pre-order that when you can pre-order it.
Just keep checking until it's available. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I want to kick us off by getting like the rundown of what everyone's approach to world building is, because I think there's probably a lot of different styles represented here. So, for example, the things I would like to know are: do you do research? Do you do background writing? Do you keep little documents on your computer? Samaiya, I'm looking at you. Do you fill out a questionnaire? Like, what is your, or do you keep it all in your head somehow because you're like a secret genius? So if everyone could just fill me in on those details, that would be great. Do we want to start with Samantha?
Oh, sure, no pressure.
Sorry.
No problem. I actually don't really keep notebooks for my world building, strangely. Like, once I have a world set out, I find it pretty easy to just jump into it. So I don't have tons of notes. What I do make notes on are research. So I do a lot of research beforehand, lots and lots of hours spent at the British Library. And then I start usually with the broader concepts, like things like what's the government like in this world, what are the different countries and how do they relate to one another, what are the religions. And then I just kind of slowly work my way down and into finer and finer details, down to what are these characters drinking and eating. And the main way I world build is I ask myself questions, basically. So I think of lists of questions and I just make sure that I can answer them. And it's not that that will necessarily appear on the page, but I just like to know them myself. And then I hope that the reader gets the sense of like a really fleshed out world. So asking myself questions like, if this is a desert country, how are they getting water? What kind of agriculture is going on? Like just loads and loads of questions like that. So that's my main technique.
Awesome. Should I just keep, do you guys want me to keep calling on you? Because I'll just do it with confidence from now on. Okay. All right, Traci, lay it on us.
Okay, so I world build by doing the least amount of work possible. And that's just to say, like, I just want to know enough so that I can tell the story, and then it's not full of holes, like logistical holes. That is to say, I do a lot of research like Samantha. I spend a lot of time perusing books that seem kind of central to whatever thing I'm writing about, but really I don't have a great system. Like, I'm very envious of the people who can write these huge world building documents or keep a like a series Bible type of thing. Nope, I have tried it and it has stymied my creative process every time. So instead I just relinquish that and decided to go, you know what? I want to write a story about pirates, and so I'm going to read some books about ships, and then I kind of go from there.
Great. Jordan, I think I kind of cut you off. Do you want to go now?
Oh yeah, no, it's fine. I think that my favorite aspect of any culture are the myths that they believe. Either if they actually believe them, like they're built into a religious system, and so they're not myths for that world, or at least not in the traditional definition of the word, or if they are just part of the lore that informs who they are. And I think that plays into the aspect of writing that I like most, which is, the people and how they interact with the world. I'm more interested with how they respond to what happens and what they think will happen than the rules of magic, for example. So I do generally start with mythologies, and those can be fun because while you can do lots of research, and I do just because I like reading myths, you can slap together different stories and narratives from so many different cultures. In Raybearer, they definitely do that with their origin story. I've gotten feedback from people from different religions saying, "Did you base this on my culture's creation of the world story?" And I was like, yes and no. But I think that when you start there, the other stuff does tend to come easily, at least for me, just because once you find out what a culture believes, it's easier for me to say, why would they come to that conclusion? Did some big traumatic event happen? And if it did, why did it happen? And how would it affect, if it was a climate event, how would it affect this kind of, economy, if it's a trading culture or if it's a war culture or something like that. So I guess in terms of research, it's one extreme or the other. Either I make it up completely because I'm talking about people and personalities, or I have a subscription on JSTOR and I download articles. For me, especially with West African stuff, it's really hard to find research because a lot of West African historians preferred oral tradition, and a lot of the stuff that's most searchable is written by colonizers who either didn't understand what they were looking at or didn't care. They just, so I rely a lot on anecdotes from family and interviews I can find from professors on YouTube, things like that, that all just go in one big chaotic bookmark folder.
Somaiya, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so as you know, I'm a big codex person. I do a lot of writing from the point of view of the people. So I have a lot of documents that are like labeled as if a historian wrote them. I also do a lot of research. If I'm like with the Mirage series, it's based on like Moroccan culture. So it's sort of a fusion of like Moroccan medieval culture. And then like, obviously like a futuristic spacefaring society. So I read a lot of research about like the court systems and court politics and poetry and how poetry like informed court politics and that kind of thing. But I also really get into the weeds. Like I had a lot of books about like the esoteric nature of hunting poetry that like in no way was relevant. And that I also mostly didn't understand because I still don't know what a nejid is, but I read a whole book on it. Yeah, so I do a lot of research, and I do have, this is part of the reason I like Scrivener, is that I have an entire folder that's just like everything that I've ever written about like what the world is, who the people are, what the government is, like how did they get into space, what is their terraforming policy, what are all of the civil wars and how did the dynasties come about, like all of this stuff. And I think when I say that, a lot of people are like, why do you have so much information? But I also write it knowing that most of it is not going to make it into the book. But that it's necessary for me to be able to write confidently, because otherwise I'll like be spinning myself around in circles when I do need to know stuff to sort of fill in conversation or the world, and I don't have access to it because I haven't thought about it. So I do a lot of preliminary work, and I sort of continue. I'm someone who really likes the form of the chronicle, so I continue to sort of fill out sort of chronicles as I'm working, just so that I have a solid understanding of what the history of the world is and how it inflects current political moments in the book and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Great.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh.
I know. I'm like, if only I could keep that organized and think that deeply about things. I'm always aspiring to that. But Jennifer, can you round us out?
I think for me, it really depends on what type of book I'm writing. If it's anything set in a contemporary setting, I don't keep a lot of notes on that. But if it's a fantasy, like built from the ground up, I have to, so that I can, it's like when you create your own world, you have to then remember the rules. And that's not going to happen for me. So luckily on one of my series, the editor created the Bible, because that's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that. Because like another had said, I think when I spend too much time writing notes, for me, it almost becomes like performance anxiety, that when I go to sit down and write it, I'm still stuck in this almost like bullet listing, and it's hard for me to make that jump. But in terms of research, again, it's what type of book I'm writing. I love doing research, but I think it has a flip side, because then I fall down these rabbit holes that I should be working, but 10 hours later, I've learned everything about virus coding to fight cancer, and I didn't even need to know that, but I ended up there from going from one thing to the next. So, but I love reading the research. And also, as it was said, like I've done a couple books based in mythology, and reading these ancient myths, and trying to determine how much of it was actually built around some level of truth, like especially when you are dealing with stuff like Greek myths and things like that. But for me, it really depends on what type of book I'm writing.
Yeah, speaking of which, you and Jennifer, you and Traci have both written inside of science fiction and fantasy, and then outside of it. And I think we talk about world building often like it only exists inside the world of science fiction and fantasy, but really like you have to build a world for any book that you write. So I wanted to ask you guys, since you've written inside and outside of sci-fi and fantasy, can you tell us about how the process of world building differs when you're writing something like historical or contemporary, as opposed to your like more fantastical works?
I will go first. Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I feel like writing We Are Not Free, which is set in World War II, was so different from writing The Reader, which is a second world fantasy, is because everything is already there. Everything is already made for you. And I loved that. I loved going to, and I think a couple of us touched on this, like firsthand accounts, as many eyewitness accounts or accounts from that time as possible. I looked through like clothing catalogs from that time to see what things were like. Everything is just there, and it's so wonderful to be able to just Google or go to the library or search an article or read a newspaper, and have it there for you. And then for the reader, which is set in a kind of pirate cowboy book magic type of world, I had to build everything from scratch, and that was it felt a lot more chaotic to me to be like, oh, now I need to know something about pirate ships, now I need to know something about gunslinging, now I need to know something about monarchies or castles. And so there was kind of a lot of different bits of research that I had to fuse together for that one, as opposed to just everything is laid out. I loved writing historical.
It's so funny to hear you say that, because to me it sounds so terrifying, because the pressure, especially with what you wrote, which is such a difficult topic to address, like the pressure to get it right would seem so scary to me. I'd rather make it up from scratch. Did you experience any of that pressure when you were writing, or did you free yourself from it?
No, I am definitely not freed of that pressure. I feel like writing it was like this huge responsibility to be respectful of the people who went through that experience. And so that was there, which also made me like really hone in on like trying to find those little details. And then if I couldn't, either because there was no record of from the people who actually lived it, or because the accounts were so conflicting, then I just kind of had to weave the needle as best I could with my own interpretation of what happened. So yes, that was difficult, but I think not as difficult as building something from the ground up. Like what Somaiya does is amazing.
Oh, I don't do that. That's part of the research, right? Is that like with Mirage, it was very much that I was doing, I was building on Morocco, and I rely on, like I talk about this with my students a lot, like my expectation of readers' familiarity with a genre, and to be able to sort of build bridges on their own. And so like, yeah, there's like, I'm always cognizant of like, well, they know what this is, so I don't have to explain that. That goes into my world building. Like I have expectations of my readers. that aids me in not feeling like I have to build everything from scratch.
Yeah. Jennifer, what was your experience of writing in multiple? I mean, you've written so many books. Looking at your back catalog was extremely impressive. So have you noticed any like trends in, what's harder or easier or anything like that?
For me, it's definitely easier to write anything that's in a contemporary real world setting, because when I do an actual like epic fantasy, you do, depending on the world that you're building, like you're like, how do I explain electricity? Because maybe they don't have that, but some other, and I'm just one of those people who fall down, because I think sometimes readers probably don't care how they get electricity, but in my mind, I'm like, I better explain this in a way that it makes sense, even though the whole world in reality would not make sense. But for me, it's a lot easier doing contemporary, whether it's like just a contemporary romance or a thriller or suspense, because you're playing in the world that already exists. So it's like you're not really having to worry about anything that's going on in the background like you do, I feel like, for me, when I'm doing fantasy or doing science fiction, where aliens.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, it's just, for me, it's easier doing the contemporary.
Sure. Well, speaking of like kind of the borders between real and not real, Somaiya and Jordan specifically, you guys both wrote books that are kind of drawing on existing cultures to build fantasy worlds. So I'm wondering how you figure out where to draw that like from the culture and where to deviate, and like how that kind of interplay of fantasy and reality works when you're using a point of inspiration as opposed to like specific details, I guess.
For me, there were a few things that I knew wanted to happen. I needed to happen in Raybearer from the perspective of a dark-skinned female protagonist. I know that growing up, my love for fairy tales was never returned. It was kind of like loving a genre that didn't love you back, because if I wanted to read a story about a girl that looked like me, it would usually involve her being at the mercy of white supremacy, or physically abused, or, in a situation of poverty, which is, and, we need those stories because that is the reality for a lot of dark-skinned girls and women throughout the world. But, it's the whole danger of a single story thing, right? Where it's just like, if that's the only mirror you only see yourself reflected in, that's really dehumanizing, because there's way more to what it's, so many empowering, wonderful things. And so the first thing I came to was, okay, all of these cultures I know I want to be coded as real world cultures, just because that's what interests me. But how is the power dynamic going to be changed so I don't have to deal with this single story of representation in this fantasy world? And so, because I knew that's one thing I wanted, I was like, okay, well, anybody who is caught that I knew the least colonized people in this like big Pangea empire of Raybearer would probably be coded Black. There are definitely, they're like the head of the empire. There are like lots of other cultures, some of which are Black, some of which are not, that are not as powerful as that one. But I wanted there to at least be that space for the protagonist's main problems to come from power instead of from subjugation, if that makes sense. So that's I guess what I'm saying is, when I decide to deviate from history in fantasy, I usually have pretty specific motivations like that. Just to be like, oh, okay, well, obviously this is going to be a version of Yoruba culture untainted by colonialization, which is huge. Colonialization has affected Yoruba culture. That's the culture that my mother's tribe is from, in Nigeria. That even their myths, it's actually kind of awesome. Even like their like boogeyman stories incorporate, like, you have the more traditional monsters, like the Abiku, the kind of demon children, and then you have one that's like, it's basically a European school marm. Like she's a boogeyman. That like, this is who you warn your children at night. She'll come and take you away. She has another name that I keep forgetting. But yeah, so I think when I choose to deviate, a lot of it is what I would like to tell with this story. That's one reason I use.
Yeah. Well, I feel like sorry, I'm just like exploding with thoughts. But Somaiya, I am wondering how that worked for you, because I think you took a different approach, still with the like awareness of colonialism, but in a different execution.
I thought a lot about and this was part of the research, I thought a lot about like what the foundational ideas in Maghrebi culture are and how they shape different types of behaviors, and how I think Jordan and I are similar in that we are thinking about like how outsiders view us and what sort of stories are told, and thinking about like my actual lived experience as like a North African woman in opposition to that. And so I did a lot of thinking of how are folktales told in Morocco? What are the sort of common motifs? I did a lot of thinking about how are women placed within those stories, the stories that we tell ourselves, versus like the popular narrative of what North African women are. And I thought a lot about cultural formation, and so like what literacy and what cultures of literature do to shape the world. And so I was less concerned with I was doing an interview questionnaire the other day, and the interviewer asked me like what Amazigh folk tales I had used in Mirage, and I was like, I didn't use any. I like made up everything, but I made it in such a way that all of these things were recognizable because they carried the same motifs, and they carried the same sort of thematic concerns that North African folk tales and stories and culture like really cares about, right? And so for me, representing like making a fantasy culture familiar to what I'm drawing from rests a lot more on like material culture. So there's a lot of clothing and facial tattoos and that sort of thing. Like any wedding sequence is like all like immediately familiar as a Moroccan wedding, right? To any reader that is familiar with like North Africa. And so that was the thing that I was more concerned with, because I also didn't want anyone coming away from the book going, this is historical fiction. And so I was really, really careful to be like, these are all like all of these mythologies are different. All of these, like, this is a different planet. They worship different gods, et cetera, et cetera. But there's enough thematic and cultural resonance happening that a lot of North African readers like recognized what I was doing and how I was building the world. And it was really freeing, because I was less concerned with like being correct, because I was like, it's not Morocco. Even though like a lot of readers are like, it's Morocco. I'm like, yeah.
Well, I lastly would love to touch base with Samantha about writing. This is partly a selfish question because I just want to take notes about writing a longer series and how you keep track of world building and make sure that you have built like a really good foundation for yourself over a longer series, because you're on book 4 now of the Bone Season.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
It is a little tricky because I actually started writing the first book when I was 19 years old and I just turned 29. So I reread all like the first 3 books the other day, and I had actually forgotten some stuff, which was really unnerving for me because I like knowing that I know my worlds really well, and generally I do. And it is easier when you've been writing one series for a long time because the world is so familiar now. I can just jump into it. Like I know that when I write the 5th book, I'll be able to do that in a few months just because it's easy for me to dive in. I know the characters really well. I know how the world functions. But yeah, it surprised me a bit when I looked back on it and I was like, oh, why did you do that, you silly girl? Just some of the earlier stuff, like seeds I'd planted. And I was like, oh, why did you plant so many seeds? Like, just calm down. It's already so complicated. But yeah, it has been a really interesting experience. And I kind of like that I ended up telling it in first person because I feel like the main character is growing with me. And I hope that as the world kind of gets bigger and develops, it feels like she's kind of maturing and I am as well, I hope. But yeah, it is a really interesting process. Slightly nerve-wracking because of the amount of time that's passed and how much I've changed personally. But my world building techniques have pretty much stayed the same. And yeah, it's just about keeping track of all the seeds you've planted over such a long time and making sure they all come to fruition. That's the main challenge of it. But yeah, generally it's fine. I feel like I know it very well now. So it's hopefully getting easier as I go along.
Well, I feel like you did a lot of thinking beforehand, which is always helpful about your, I don't know, about stuff like currency and food. And anyway, I am looking at our questions submitted from our audience, and someone asked, for those of you who do, this isn't a direct quote, but for those of you who do writing like outside of the writing of the book, Diana would like to know, what does a book Bible look like if we wanted to create our own? I don't know if any of you said that you had a book Bible per se, but if you write extra documents like that don't end up factoring into the text, what are they like?
I made one for the map illustrator once, I remember, for the Priory of the Orange Tree, because she asked me for more information about the world. So I just made like a document and I did like each country had a title and I just kind of explained a bit about it. I think that's about as close as I've ever got to a series Bible. It's just a little paragraph of general information. But yeah, that's pretty much all I've got.
I should have looked at my codex folder.
You have a codex folder though.
I have a codex folder. This is the scholar in me. So that's the first thing. And I also do know that I'm quite at the like extreme limit of world building. So I don't recommend that you do this unless your mind is as frenetic as mine and needs this many details. But I really do have like, places of note, people of note, events of note, and then I have conflicting histories because I love historiography and I like, yeah. So I like having like these people think that this happened, but these people think that this happened, and this is actually what happened. I do write I don't know, like probably a lot of people who are watching this have played the Dragon Age series. So I actually modeled them on the Dragon Age codex system and how the codexes are written in Dragon Age, because I found that really helpful. And I thought that it was a really cool way to build the world without exposition, and also like a voluntary opt-in. So I write them like that. And I also have like a set of historians in my brain so that I can assign who's writing what and what motivations. Yeah, I know. Jordan's laughing and I'm like, yeah, I know. This sounds really
I love it.
I feel like Traci's also like,
when I don't feel like writing the actual book, I sit down and I do this.
I love it. I could never do it, but I super am fascinated by it.
That is the most wonderful flex I've ever heard. Building method to have historians in my brain.
Yeah, you have to decide, because one of the like, sorry, I'm gonna sound like such a dick. One of the thematic concerns for me when I'm writing is like how deep history, because I'm a Victorianist, how deep history affects like modern trauma. And so that's part of the reason that I do all of that. So I think the thing that I tell my students all the time is like, make sure that if you're going to do the document, that it's functional for you. So like, what do you need to get out of it? I need a sense that I have an Anglo-Saxon Chronicle sitting somewhere in my Scrivener folder. That's the psychological need that it serves. You probably don't have like a miniature Tolkien in your head going, say it in this way. In which case, like, be thinking about like, what is this going to do for you and how is it going to help you write? Because I have heard from a lot of other writers that like, for them, codexes are crippling and they feel like they have to include everything. And I also write knowing that almost none of it is going to appear in the book. Like I have a 2,000-year timeline. 2 events off of the timeline actually show up in the project that I'm writing. And I knew that going in when I made that timeline. But I also did need, for me, my brain needed the 1,000 years.
So.
If it helps, oh, don't worry.
Oh, no, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt anyone, but you know, virtual.
No, I was just going to say very briefly, I do have a 7,000 word etymology document if it helps. So huge document about names, but not about anything else.
I really love this. And Jennifer, what I was going to ask you is, because you've written like multiple fantasy worlds, so do you ever find yourself like repeating things or trying not to repeat things like across series, or is that not difficult for you at all?
Oh, that's extremely difficult. It's like one of my biggest concerns when I'm writing is, you know, making sure that, you know, not just the world, but the characters are different, and, you know, that they can't be interchangeable with a series. That is a huge thing. Luckily, it's for me, it's usually focusing on the characters themselves. I feel like if you make them different enough, they interact with the world, so it kind of keeps that world different, so they're not becoming too similar with one another. But that is, I lose sleep over that.
Yeah, speaking of which, we have a question from our audience from Yasmin, who asked, how do you tie in character building with your world building, and what comes first? This is for anyone, if you want to weigh in.
I think, like I said earlier, I'm always so interested with how the people of the world interact with it. And that's what inspires me to make things. It's just like, what kind of interactions do I want to see? The original drafts of Raybearer, which I started when I was actually 13, a long time ago, actually are set 200 years in the future from where the book ended up starting in its final draft, because I saw the main character through the eyes of people who lived after she was dead, who then look back on her and see her with this mythological quality, like she was a god, even though she wasn't. And the more and more I built up this world, that's how I knew eventually that it was her story I actually wanted to tell, through how people saw her and interacted with her. So, you know, I started with that place of wanting there to be this heroine that was venerated. And then, you know, you ask, why is she venerated? What's important to these people? What did she do for them? Are they right? Do they have the story right about what happened? And if not, why did they change it? You know, and all of that stuff comes out. And of course, when it's based on real world cultures, or at least when it's coded to real world cultures, a lot of that imagery comes in a lot more easily. Yeah, that's where I start.
I think for me, the character and the world building, and also a theme or a question that I am interrogating as a creative person, all kind of come together. And I'm thinking of the main character, Safiya in The Reader, is a 16-year-old girl with a magic book in a world where nobody else knows that books exist, really. And so there's like a system of magic that's all around literacy and reading and writing, and the question, like the thematic question, is how is literacy actually power? And so like that is a theme that I'm interrogating, and it comes in this main character who is learning to read herself, and in the magic system as well. So they all kind of happen at the same time for me.
For me, the character becomes the engine through which I ask myself questions, like it's how I filter questions. So I will put, the character becomes the engine for the world building. So say you put a character on the street, I'll be saying, okay, well, what's the street like? What's the character smelling and hearing? What's she seeing as she walks? She goes into a bar, what's she drinking? So it helps me to filter the number of questions I'm asking myself and make sure that they're relevant.
right, guys. Sorry, I'm not going to cut anyone off, but someone else, Ryan, I believe, asked something that I also wanted to ask. So well done, Ryan. What's a world building trait that you often see ignored or less prioritized? And one of the reasons I wanted to ask this is that one time a reader asked me what everyone does for underwear in my world, and I was like, that never occurred to me, but like clearly it's something that like bothered them. And so everyone's got their thing that they're like, well, what are they doing about tampons, you know? So anyway, is there anything that you guys see frequently ignored in fantasy or sci-fi that bothers you?
One of my biggest pet peeves is the universal religion fantasy trope. It's just like, I'm just like,
Yeah.
It always astounds me. I'm just like, oh, so they all just agree? And they're like, yeah, because, you know, if magic interacts with the world, then that proves that it's real. So they'd all agree, right? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like, even within a religion, it would all be like a bunch of factions. Like, you know, like, yes, so the god is real, but we're the god's favorite people. And those people are cursed because of this thing they did in the past. And in terms of the pantheon, here are the good gods and here are the bad gods. And no, these are the good gods and these are bad. Like, it's just like, I love all of that cultural squabble. To me, that just like is rife with potential. And it also is the only way religion has ever played out in our world, I think, because of the way humans are. So I will say that that's, even within the world of Raybearer, some people are like, wow, so many religions. And even that's a way simplified version. There are basically 4 main sects within this empire of religion. And to me, that's super simple. And yet I just was trying to play to, you know, if people are used to reading about like one unifying religion, 4 will already be a lot for them to keep track of, you know? So yeah, I'd say that's maybe one of my, one of the areas I feel are underdeveloped in a lot of fantasy universes.
Somaiya, it seems like you might agree.
Yeah, I do. Now that Jordan said that, my thing is, I love Star Wars, but the one planet, one culture thing drives me nuts. They all like, that drives me nuts. And the Phantom Menace got the closest to being like, they're not all one culture, but like this is my eternal frustration with George Lucas, is that we never actually get into anything that's more interesting than the like one planet, one culture thing. So, and I also have like a flip thing where I don't want to know how bathrooms work in your fantasy or science fiction. And then people explain it and I'm like,
Sometimes you don't like the answer.
Well, no, it's not that I don't like the answer. It's that I'm just like, I don't want to know how these people go to the bathroom. This is not interesting to me. Whenever I read a historical romance and someone is like the chamber pot, I'm like, get that out of here.
Chamber pot has no place in this story. Anyone else? Pet peeves?
Actually, the tampons one for me. Like, I know it's kind of, I do sometimes would like occasionally for someone to acknowledge periods in fantasy. And it does happen sometimes, but not always. So I did make an effort to include them just casually in the Priory of the Orange Tree. And I've just introduced it to the Bone season as well. I think some people will be like, oh, it is kind of like just, do we need to know about that? But I'm like, yeah, just a mention, maybe just now and again, just to normalize it. But
yeah, notably in Ray Carson's Girl of Fire and Thorns, I think is the title of that series. There's like birth control and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, yes, Ray! You got it.
Can I say one that I love?
Sure.
Instead of answering the question as asked, I was like to say that I really love reading about folklore. Like, just like the little kind of folk legends, they're not codified anywhere. They're just like, maybe just like this one story that this one village tells, and that's a little bit different from a story that another village tells. I find that so interesting, and I find it's like such a great way to make a world feel really rich, to have different kind of folk tales going around.
Jennifer, do you have an answer, or do you want me to move on?
You can move on.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left, so I thought it would be good to end with some of our favorite examples of good world building, whether they're in genre fiction or elsewhere, whether they're movies or TV or books, just what our audience can look to as like fine examples of world building.
For me, 100% the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin.
Oh my god.
I know everyone always has the same reaction when I say it. Everyone's like, yes. It's because she does something which I think is really key to creating a convincing world, which is layering. So you don't just get a sense of what the world is right now, but also what it has been. And I think that's so important because it gives the sense that the reader, it's not that the world is being constructed for the reader. It's almost like it's always been there and the reader's just visiting it. And that's the thing that comes from layering for me. And I think she does that brilliantly in the 5th season. Like there's just so many layers to it and so much history. You can just really feel not only the physical layers of the world, but just the layers of time. And yeah, I love that book. It's brilliant.
Okay, so I was gonna also say the 5th season, but can
Sorry.
I add? I just listened to this podcast with her and Ezra Klein on Vox.
Yep.
Yes, and it's so good. So if you want to like hear a little bit about N.K. Jemisin's world building process, I recommend checking out that episode. N.K. Jemisin, Ezra Klein, Vox. Really good.
It's a really good podcast, but it will make you depressed for a little bit when you realize just how good she is. Like she starts from the tectonic plates. She doesn't start from like what do their clothes look like. It's like what foundation of the world caused the climate that causes the empire. It's expensive.
Jennifer, were you about to?
One of the series that I've always, whenever I would do panels, I would always say for me was, and a great example of world building was Larissa Ion's Demonica series. It's an adult series, and it's about these demons who run an underground hospital for other demons. So when they get injured, they come to this underground hospital that none of the humans know about, except for a team of people who are kind of out, to end the demons. But she kind of drops you in this world, but gives you enough information at the perfect time that is completely believable, and you're never lost. Like you don't have, because I think all of us always worry about info dumps, right? When we're trying to establish a world building, we're worried about overwhelming someone or not giving them enough information that they're lost through the first, 10 chapters. But she does an amazing example of just feeding little bits and pieces of information as the story goes, that you're never lost, you're never overwhelmed, and you find yourself when you need it to know the information, she's given it to you. So that's one of the examples I've always give people.
I am sorry to cut us off, but I think we are now out of time. Thanks so much, guys. This was awesome. I have so much stuff to think about now. Again, if you're watching this, you can get signed books at yallwrite.org/books. And yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.